My name is Rashida Justo, and I'm a professor of entrepreneurial management at IE Business School, which is located in Spain, Madrid. All right, so my motivation for this research started when I started working on my PhD thesis. My dissertation was trying to examine the performance of female owned business and how they compare it to male-owned businesses. And at that time, there was this idea that females have different drivers when they look at the entrepreneurial activity. So they get into self-employment or they start businesses very often for different reasons than the assumed reasons that male have that are more related to making profits or growth-oriented type of motivations. So this was one of the main idea that was really very gaining momentum at that time. And at the same time, there was this very prevailing notion of what we call the female underperformance hypothesis. So the idea that female entrepreneurs do not really measure up to their male peers. So my thesis was around these issues. Now, with my co-authors, beyond the thesis and in other aspects of research, I was working on co-authors that have been working for a long time on entrepreneurial exit. And they started to work with this notion that the concept of exit and failure might not be exactly the same thing, which is something also that was assumed by a lot of entrepreneurship researchers. And the assumption was, if you exit the business, this is due generally to poor performance of the business. And we started talking together, we're surprised to see that despite the fact that some female entrepreneurship researchers were challenging the fact that businesses are small because they don't have the skill to grow that business, but rather because they actually are motivated by other drivers, like, for example, keeping control on the business or really providing better quality instead of having a growing business. We're surprised that this type of conversation didn't really go into examining the supposed failure, higher failure rates of females. So we started debating on that, and we decided to try to do research on that topic. So we had basically two research questions, one deriving from the other. The first one is, do really female fail more often than male? Fail meaning not necessarily exit, but really do they really underperform less to the point that they have to close the business? And if the answer was no, then why do they exit more often? And answering the first research question, we found that indeed females exited more often, right? And when we started digging into, okay, why do they exit more often? So started really looking at the motives behind this exit from the business or the closure of the business, what we realized is that actually if you dig deeper and disentangle between what is a forced exit because of poor performance or financial reason and what is a voluntary exit decision. So I'm exiting a business despite quite acceptable financial performance. Then you see that, in fact, females exit more voluntarily than male peers, everything else being equal, right? So that was the first hunch that we had that got confirmed by the data. And then the second one was, okay, if they exit voluntarily, what is behind that? Why do they leave their business more often despite good performance? And what we saw is that, in fact, there were kind of two reasons. Initially, we didn't see a gender pattern behind it. And it was either personal reasons or exiting for other opportunities, other job opportunities, better financial situation, like, for example, selling the business at profit. So we started looking at what was happening behind these two types of voluntary exit decisions. So in terms of how we gathered the data, and especially how we made sense of the results, we had two types of techniques, if you want. The first one is the simple survey that we relied on in order to have a sample of entrepreneurs that had exited their business, right? And we sent a survey to these people saying it was 2 months, they had exited the business during the 12 previous months, and we simply asked them, why did you exit the business, right? Now, The other type of data collection technique that we used was more to make sense of these quantitative results. So we did interviews on specific cases of female entrepreneurs that had actually voluntarily exited the business, and we had personal interviews with them to understand why they had made this decision. And it was interesting because in these very few interviews, to be honest, but they were very, very interesting because we had conversations about, for example, how the business was so successful that actually it went public, and by going public, the motivation and the goals and the objective of the company derives from being a simple lifestyle of a business or doing the right thing according to the founder, towards actually having a good pricing or having optimal share price, et cetera. And that didn't make sense. No longer it made sense for her. So these are the kind of things that help us make sense of the quantitative data that we had in the survey. It is a challenge. We were fortunate enough to have a very big survey. So in that sense, we were able to at least have a minimum number of respondents that were useful for our data. But in general, I think what is very difficult is actually to making speak for a long time about the failure and go into the details of that failure, if it's a failure. But if it's in a voluntary exit, people are much more open to talk about their personal reasons, or there's not so much issues in saying, I found a very interesting professional opportunity, which, by the way, came because I had experience in my business. That is not as problematic in terms of stigma, for example, as saying I failed and then I closed the business. So in that sense, it was easier than digging into the failure reasons, right? One of the arguments that we're making in the paper is actually that females, for a series of gender socialization, what we call gender socialization, so how they were brought up and how they were educated, they generally have less tendency to have what we call the escalation of commitment. So they generally let go the business more easily if there is a need to recognize that that the business is not really performing as much as they expected it to perform. So that's also what we call this idea of psychological ownership. Their self-identity, because they have been educated sometimes differently, their social identity is not so much tied to the success of the business, which is good and bad depending on the context, right? That makes them generally launch less businesses, but also be more open to close quickly, fail quickly if they have to. So the implications of my research, there is one very obvious, I think, which is that, in fact, as far as exit and failure is concerned, really, we have some evidence that they are as skillful as males in terms of making their business perform well. And I think this has implication in terms of investors, any type of financial institutions, or any type of supporting institution that at least have to really go and help and accompany entrepreneurs without that stereotype that they don't really measure up to their male peers. And I think this is important. Now, the flip side of this implication also is that if they're more likely to exit voluntarily, maybe we want to look at the non-economic factors that make the business no longer interesting for them. Assuming that, for example, as policymakers, we want the business to continue on going, right? I'm working on that assumption. But these, I think, are the two implications that are kind of both sides of the same coin, you know? I think there is a very positive and obvious one. The other one is a little bit more complex, and I think that actually it deserves future research. What does it mean? Why do they exit more voluntarily? Because behind the word voluntary, there is a big black box. So when some of them tell us in the interviews, I left this business simply because I had to take care of the family. How voluntary is that? Right? So I think that deserves further inquiry, and I think it's an interesting implication from the standpoint of the entrepreneurs and the practice. Okay. And then there is another interesting implication that I think also deserves a little bit more research, which is we found that family situation does have an implication also on the likelihood of male entrepreneurs to exit and the exit motives. So specifically, for example, if they are in a spousal relationship, they are more likely to exit for other professional opportunities than to exit involuntarily. Or and also we found that the children affect male exit patterns as opposed to female, which was our initial hypothesis. So I think also this idea that family only affects female entrepreneurial activities is challenged, and I think it deserves a little bit more inquiry too.